All right, I think we'll begin. Thank you for your patience. We have the audiovisual up and running. So we'll do some abridged remarks just to open the conference. Dear honored guests, distinguished invited speakers, DNSG members, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Stephen-Piper. I'm from the University of Toronto and St. Michael's Hospital. And on behalf of my co-chairs, Laura Cabaroli and Cyril Kendall from the University of Toronto and St. Michael's Hospital, we welcome you to the 42nd International Symposium on Diabetes and Nutrition. I want to start first with a land acknowledgement. The City of Ottawa acknowledges, and this site, this location here at the Chateau Laurier are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. This acknowledgement recognizes the Algonquin people as the original inhabitants and traditional guardians of the land and its surrounding waterways. We are truly thrilled to host this symposium and to be able to bring you all to Ottawa, a place you might not have come otherwise. So thank you for taking the extra leg on your trip to be able to come here knowing that there are not many direct flights. And thank you to those that lost their luggage for bearing with us. And I see, Jordy, you have fresh clothes, so maybe I think that your luggage may have arrived. But thank you for bearing all of those travails on your travels and to be with us here. For those of you that don't know anything about the Diabetes Nutrition Study Group, the DNSG, and this symposium, it has been held every year since 1982. So except for 1 year during COVID in 2020 when it was meant to be in Spain, but we'll be going back next year because it was online for that year. So it was canceled the 1 year and then online the next. So it's our 42nd, but our 43rd year since the group was formed in 1982 by Jim Mann and colleagues. The Diabetes Nutrition Study Group has an affiliation with the European Association Study of Diabetes, formerly a study group, but now an affiliated group with EASD. And it has over 100 standing members, all international leaders in their respective areas of research. This is only the second time that it's been outside Europe. It's a European meeting. The first time was in Toronto 10 years ago, so we're bringing it back to Canada one more time. So we thank the group for accommodating us and allowing us to bring it outside Europe one more time. We feel that it's especially fitting in Canada because Canada obviously has a special place in the history of diabetes with Banting and Best. It was over 100 years ago that a young surgeon, Frederick Banting, along with his co-workers Charles Best, James Collip, and John McLeod, discovered insulin and were awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. This is a truly international meeting. We have over 130 delegates from over 20 countries, which are registered, including physicians, dietitians, diabetes educators, other allied health professionals, and both academic and industry scientists and many, many trainees and students. We have delegates from Australia and New Zealand in the south, and I want to acknowledge the long travel, Andrew and Jenny and Alan and those that have made the trip from down under, from your winter to come join us in our summer. From Norway, Sweden, Finland in the north, for many of our Northern European colleagues who had a midsummer, so thank you for being here with us so close to your holidays. The Philippines and Singapore from the east, and then many from US and Canada here in the west. So we have an exciting program with really outstanding faculty. We have 40 invited speakers this year. It's a very jam-packed program, so we're going to ask everyone to try to keep on time and have our chairs keep everyone on time. Over 20 sessions, and we have 41 oral abstracts that will be presented in short oral and longer oral, although all very short abstracts as well from our trainees and others. We've planned an exciting social program as we do with this meeting and the great tradition of the symposium. We planned some wonderful social events. So we have a historical walking tour today. So after the meeting, you'll have some time to refresh about an hour, and then we'll head out on the historical walking tour, and we'll get more information at the end to the Byward Market, and then onward afterwards to our dinner in the Byward Market. Tomorrow night we have some free time, which I think everyone will need with a jam-packed program, and then we have a contemporary Canadian experience at 18 Restaurant, and we'll have instructions for that. And then our gala dinner, I think, will be a very special evening at the National Gallery. We did the walkthrough yesterday. I think it should be fabulous. We hope these events will give you some lasting memories of Ottawa and Canada and help strengthen existing relationships and collaborations and forge new ones. So a few housekeeping items. There are washrooms out to the left. If you were to exit the doors, the washrooms are out to the left. As many of you saw, but if you didn't make it this morning, the meals will be in the drawing room, which is out to your right, but we will have a coffee station for people like me that need a lot of coffee, during the whole symposium. It will be constantly refreshed. We have Wi-Fi, and I just want to give you information about that. So it's Fairmont underscore meeting or /meeting. And the login code is, and we maybe can put that on some slides too, I think it will be DNSG 2025. So DNSG 2025, that's Fairmont underscore meeting. And we'll put that up on a slide later, but for those of you that want to get on. The program is online, DNSG2025.ca, but we also have some printed copies of the program, which you can get at the desk. There will be video and photography. We have an online component. There'll be some delegates joining us online. Your consent is implied, but if you do not want to be on camera, we would ask that you please avoid being on the camera, because if you ask a question, or obviously if you're presenting, it will be broadcast to the online group. Recordings from this event will be made available on the website, but just to assure the speakers, we will reach out first because we know that there are some unpublished data to ensure that any unpublished data is removed if you don't want it shared. So with that, we hope that you share excitement for the next few days. We're fortunate to have a couple of individuals help us opening the meeting. And first, I'd like to call on Andrea Grantham, who's the Executive Director of our Canadian Nutrition Society. I'm a board member of the Canadian Nutrition Society, and Andrea has helped grow our society incredibly, and she's just going to bring a very quick welcome from our Canadian Nutrition Society.
Good morning. John just asked me to do this morning, so bear with me. So I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Nutrition Society. We are a society of about 1,000 individuals who represent clinicians, scientists, academia, government. We have a very strong trainee program. And our goal is to bring evidence-based nutrition information and how that plays out into practice. And we do that under a number of ways: webinars, workshops. We have an annual conference, and I know Boudin Louvi's here, and our next conference is in Halifax, May 2026, so I'll put a plug for that. And we also have a one-day thematic conference on GLP-1 health and nutrition that John is co-chairing as well. So, and this is my hometown. I actually got married in this hotel, so it's very special. And so I welcome you to Ottawa, and have a great conference.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I did put her on the spot, so thank you very much. That's wonderful for bringing some greetings from our Canadian Nutrition Society. So finally, I'd like to invite my co-chair, Cyril Kendall, as the president and chairperson of our Diabetes Nutrition Society group to do the final opening remarks.
Thank you, John, for a wonderful introduction and an overview of the meeting. On behalf of the DNSG and as chair of the DNSG, I'd like to welcome all of my friends and colleagues. It's a wonderful hotel. I hope you enjoy it, and it's in a wonderful city of Ottawa. It's very beautiful. Hopefully you can spend some time enjoying that as well. I think we have a jam-packed program. I think we're really happy and excited about all the speakers we have. It should be very enjoyable and interesting. And I hope you enjoy our social program as well, which should also be wonderful as well. Anyways, let's the games begin, and let's get rolling with the program. Enjoy.
Thank you. So I'd invite our first set of chairs to please come up and introduce the first session.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Hanna Kaliova. I'm from the Czech Republic, and I live in the US in Washington, D.C. And this is my co-chair, Tausif Khan, and he's on the local organizing committee from the University of Toronto. And we have the pleasure of introducing the first plenary lecture. How many of you have a sweet tooth? Anybody? When I saw the topic, I was super excited. So it's my pleasure to introduce the first lecture, Does the Sweetness of the Diet Matter? Lessons learned from the Sweet Tooth Study. And I will let Tausif introduce our speaker, Professor Kees de Graaf from the Netherlands.
Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Professor Kees de Graaf. So just a short introduction. Professor de Graaf works at the Sensory Science and Eating Behavior Division of the Human Nutrition and Health at Wageningen University in Netherlands. He has been working on sweet taste perception since 1988 and has more than 300 papers, many of which relate to sweet perception, sweet preferences, and impact on eating behavior. He will be talking to us about today about the sweet tooth study. So, Professor.
Thank you very much. Yeah, first, it's an honor to be here. I'm thrilled to be here in Ottawa. It's such a nice place. To be honest, I was in Orlando a few weeks ago at the ASN, and this is so much better. This is, yeah. I'm also thrilled because for me, I was trained as a nutritionist in the 1970s. And in the 1980s, after traveling in Asia, I accidentally fell into the area of sensory science, and my supervisor at that time, he asked me to do some studies on the sweetness perception of mixtures of sugars and sweeteners, and that was in the 1980s. So I became a bit of a combination of a nutritionist with a sensory scientist, and I did indeed a couple of hundred studies on sweetness and its effect on food choice and intake. And for me, this trial is really the cherry on the pie of my whole career, because it's about the, I would say, sweetness for nutrition and health. So, and I'm so happy to share it with you, the results. I also would like to share the picture low on the left is Eva Tjaat. She's the first author of the trial. She's PhD fellow, and she organized the whole trial in about and worked for 6 years in a perfect manner. So I'm very grateful to her. Here's some disclosures on connections that various authors have with various partners. I must say the whole trial, the Sweet Tooth trial, was governed by a steering committee of independent scientists from the University of Copenhagen, Liverpool, Dutch Diabetes Organization, Dutch Organization for Public Health, and the French Centre de Goût, to make sure that the design of the trial was independently monitored. Of course, because it's a sensitive subject to study sweetness. I'll start with the background and aim and design of the study. Well, most of us, I think almost entirely everybody in the world loves sweetness. Some people like it more, some people like it less, but it's an inborn preference. But there's a narrative around sweetness that if you consume more of it, that you will increase its preference. So if you expose people to a higher sweetness or more frequent exposure to sweetness, that will lead to a higher sweetness preference. And in the end, that's also the narrative. It will lead to sugar will induce pleasantness, and that will induce eating, and that will induce overconsumption. And that's a very popular narrative, well, at least 50 years, and it's still going around. When you look at the lay literature, it's all over the place, but also in some of the scientific literature, it's still over the place. You'll also see that reflected in messages from public health institutions like the World Health Organization. Also here in Canada, the food guide in Canada, they argue that you shouldn't consume sugar substitutes because then you are maintaining a higher level of preference for sweetness, and it's like sweetness is a bit addictive, that you should get rid of it before you can get healthy, and that limits overconsumption. However, if you look at the actual data, I've brought in quite some data, short-term studies, also some longer-term studies looking at the relationship between sweetness exposure and sweetness liking. And most studies do not find any relationship. And also the relationship between sweetness preference and obesity, that has been studied, the sweet tooth hypothesis of obesity, that has been studied over and over again, and over and over again. It came to the same conclusion that there was no relationship between sweetness preference and obesity, but still intuitively it's so powerful, the narrative, that people, when they come into the field, they start to do the question again. And so it's very persistent. So therefore, we thought that there's really a need for a long-term rigorous study to see what the effect is of a long-term exposure of either a low, regular, or a high dietary exposure to sweetness preferences. Does it really affect your liking for sweetness? And that was the primary aim of the study. And the secondary aims were that we also looked at sweetness intensity perception, but we also looked at body weight, energy intake, food cravings. We looked at ad libitum food and energy intake, but also at markers for cardiovascular disease and diabetes. This is the design of the trial. We had about 180 subjects who started with a baseline measure of their sweetness preferences. Then they were exposed to either a diet high in sweetness or a regular sweetness exposure or low sweetness exposure. And after 6 months, we ended the trial, but there's a follow-up of 4 more months. So that in total, the whole trial lasted for I think, 10 to 12 months, including baseline and follow-up measurements. We had quite a rigorous methodology. First, it took us a year to convince the ethics committee that the high sweetness exposure wouldn't gain weight and that there were no data on that. But in the end, they were convinced looking at the data. We had a trial registered at clinicaltrial.gov, and we also had a data analysis plan registered there. And we did the data analysis first. We did it blind, so that we didn't know which group was producing what type of data. In the end, it didn't matter much, but we didn't know that beforehand. And we also had an external monitoring from the study who checked all our procedures, whether it was correct and the data input was correct. So it was quite an extensive control of the whole trial. First, the dietary intervention, how did it look like? In the Dutch diet, the regular sweetness exposure is about 25 to 30% of energy coming from sweet foods. I won't tell you how we calculated that. That's a whole story in itself, and that would take a long time. But that's the average intake of sweetness in the Dutch diet, and also some other countries have a similar intake. The low sweetness exposure group had an intake of about 10 to 15% of energy from sweet foods, basically meaning that it was only fruit that was the basis of sweetness and no other sweet foods. But the high dietary exposure group, they consumed about 45% of the total energy from sweet tasting foods. And that included also low energy sweeteners. Here you see the distribution of sweet food intake of the whole Dutch population, the total distribution. And here you also see the 3 dietary intervention groups positions. So the diets were, I guess they were also relevant for, or they were appropriate for Dutch consumers. It was not an extreme diet that nobody consumed, but it was a diet that was also adhered to by or followed by many Dutch people. Here you see some daily menus, and in the low sweetness group, it was only the fruit that was tasting sweet, and we provided the other ones for up till about 50% of food we distributed to the delivered foods at home to the subjects. With the regular group, there were, of course, more products that tasted sweets. You can think of bread toppings, but also dairy foods like sweetened yogurt and other foods, sauces. And the high sweetness group had a lot of products, including also low energy drinks, soft drinks, and other foods that in total comprised 45% of the dietary intake daily. I will directly go to the results. We aimed the power calculations made us think that we needed about 180 subjects to detect a difference in sweetness preference along a psychohedonic curve. So we had 60 people per group, and we had very little fallout from the people. Part of the study was carried out through COVID, but we did go on only at a much smaller speed, so that we could maintain social distancing. The groups were quite well matched for age and BMI, and we also had a measure of what you would call sweet liker status. That's a measure that's developed by a British group of Martin Yeomans, and they measure the liking response to a 1.0 molar sucrose solution, and thereby they distinguish between low sweetness liker, medium, or high sweetness liker, and we randomized the 3 groups with that distribution into context. The primary outcome measure was the liking for a number in total 6 sweet foods, 2 liquids, 2 semi-solids, and 2 solids. 3 familiar products and 3 unfamiliar products, and they had a sweetness from very low to very high. It took us about 2 years to develop these measures, so it's a kind of generalized liking for sweet taste across a variety of products. Here's actually the main outcome of the study at comparing the liking for these products across different concentration at month 6 compared to month 1. And what you can see is that these curves, they follow what you would expect, an inverted U shape with a kind of bliss point in the middle. That's what you would expect with most sensory signals like sweetness or saltiness or bitterness or anything. But you actually see that the 3 groups at baseline, of course, they fall across over each other, but there's actually no shift in the preference at month 6. So sweetness preference in this case stays very stable and is stable for each group. Also, here is the different time points, and we see at no time point, we see actually a difference in optimal sweetness preference concentration. So yeah, these sweetness preferences were very, very stable. What we know from a lot of work on in sensory science is that familiarity has a large effect on liking. The more people are exposed to a particular food, and that's of course also the basis of that narrative, and the more you get exposed to a particular flavor or a food, the more you will like it. We looked at that as well, comparing the familiar with the unfamiliar foods, and indeed that's what we see, that the familiar foods are more liked than the unfamiliar foods, but the pattern of the psychohedonic function, as we call it in sensory science, is identical. So it's only at a different level. So here we see no change. For me, one of the most exciting results, or I was pretty excited by the previous results that we didn't see any change. That was also more or less what I expected on the basis of earlier studies. But this graph shows, I think, one of the most exciting results is that here we see the contribution of sweet-tasting foods to the energy intake across the trial. And what you see very clearly is that whereas we had the regular sweetness group remains at the same level of sweetness throughout the trial, but the high sweetness group, we were aiming at 45%, but in the end they achieved about 27%. So much lower than we targeted for. The low sweetness group, they arrived at more or less at the target, but I thought it was striking that the high sweetness group didn't reach the target that we actually aimed for. It was an ad libitum trial. It was not a force-feeding trial, so we couldn't force people to eat and drink their sweet foods. But I think this is quite striking. And what is also striking is I think that at the end of the trial, at the follow-up, people fall back to the regular sweetness diet. So the low sweetness group falls back to the regular sweetness, and the high sweetness group also falls back to the regular sweetness intake. So apparently there's a kind of drive to maintain the sweetness of your diet at a certain level. This is energy percentage. This is weight percentage, of proportion of weight of sweet foods. And here the high sweet diet stands out. I think this is mainly effect of volume or weight, because the high sweet group, they consumed low energy sweetened drinks. And of course, they have a much lower energy density and a much higher weight. So there's the difference between the energy density and percent of energy and percent of weight. When we looked at body weight, nothing actually happens. We had a flat curve, so the low sweetness group didn't lose weight and the high sweetness group didn't gain weight. They were very weight stable. When we looked at markers for diabetes, glucose, we see no difference. With insulin, we also see no difference. We also have data, but not yet completely analyzed, of dynamic glucose monitoring for about half of the subjects during these periods, but there we also see no difference. Here, the measure for cardiovascular disease, we also see no difference. So, sounds a bit boring, but actually, we see no difference in preference between the three groups. We do see differences between familiar and unfamiliar foods in liking. This is also what we expected. I think one of the major results is that the people in the high sweetness group didn't reach the level that we actually aimed for. So apparently there's a kind of break in how much people can tolerate sweetness. And the story is, of course, that sweetness is addictive and that you need more and more. But I think it's the opposite. When you have we did studies also, I think about 10, 15 years ago, when we, that was more a force-feeding trial where we gave people for 24-hour only sweet foods compared to only savory foods. And after 24-hour, people really got sick of all the sweet foods. And so when you tell the story, I think you can, yeah, it's easy to understand. There's a kind of level that you want for your sweet food intake. And what's also striking is that people after the trial, the high and low sweetness group, they return to their baseline levels. Well, also no effect on body weight or biomarkers for diabetes or cardiovascular disease. So in summary, I think neither a high or low exposure to sweet tasting foods for 6 months significantly changes sweet taste preferences. Subjects in the low and high sweetness group return to the original levels. And sweet taste perception, the intensity perception and other measures, they were also not affected by sweet taste exposure. For me, one of the most essential elements of the whole trial and of my whole thinking is that sweet taste is actually, sweetness is of course a nutrient sensor. Taste is sensing nutrients, and the digestion and its physiological consequences, they not only start in the GI tract, but it starts in the mouth. From the taste buds, there's a lot of signals going to the brain stem, and of course the brain stem is connected to the whole GI system. So I think there's a strong functional role for taste in actual intake, and of course you see that with salt in relation to fluid intake. Too low salt is not, people cannot tolerate, but too high salt people also cannot tolerate. And of course, salt is also a nutrient that is signaled and that is maintained for, I would say, nutrient intake. With sweet taste, I think when you are exposed to sweet taste on your tongue, that signals satiation. That reminds me of a movie I made a long time ago. And I think some of you may have seen it already, but I think it very clearly shows how this works. And this is a person, he was a PhD student in his first year, so I could expose him easily to that, but he enjoyed it. He had 2 kilograms of grapes, one in the form of grapes and one in the form of grape juice, and you can see the difference. The movie lasts 1 minute. There's no sound. Well, I guess the message is very clear. Taste is not only liking and pleasantness, but it has a very strong functional role in intake. And when you get exposed to taste, sweet taste, like for instance with an apple, or you cannot consume a kilogram of apples. It will your whole system responds to that, that you have a resistance of too much sweet taste. And of course, with drinks, it's so easy, you gulp it down, but then with drinks, you're not exposed to the sweet taste because most of the sugar passes behind the sense of taste and you don't sense it. And so it's with drinks, and of course, I think that's also the principal mechanism behind the obesogenic capacity of sugar-sweetened beverages. Of course, you taste it, but only very, very briefly, and it doesn't signal satiation to the brain. And I think that's one of the main reasons that sugar-sweetened beverages lead to obesity, because the sensing doesn't work. To summarize, I think guidelines, public health guidelines also of the WHO and other organizations to limit sweetness, I think they're nonsense and they lead to nothing. Of course, there's a moral dimension to it, that if you enjoy something very much, it must be bad for you in some ways. But I think that's not the way that we proceed with nutrition science. And also, most people should enjoy food. And I think enjoyment is also part of health and the whole experience of food. With respect to added sugar guidelines, I think it's very important that you take texture into account, food form. Of course, there's a huge difference between sugars in liquid form or in semi-solid form compared to foods that you have to chew. And of course, also in relation to other parameters as like the glycemic index, of course, there's a huge difference in the rate that you consume a food has a strong effect. And finally, I think guidelines, nutrition guidelines to prevent overconsumption, I think they should be evidence-based. We do have a large amount of evidence in relation to properties of food that affect energy intake, and I think that's related to things like the energy density of foods. I think there's been so many studies that if you lower energy density, you lower energy intake. Portion sizes is, of course, a very important element in the total energy intake, but also, I would say, the energy intake rate of foods. We made an inventory of hundreds of foods, how fast you can consume a certain food, and there are vast differences in the amount, in the rate at which people can eat. So I think that's important to focus on not on things like sweetness or other things that do not work. Of course, then we can go on and on and on, but it doesn't help. So finally, I would like to acknowledge first the Dutch government for supporting this trial, and also the companies that supported the trial. And of course, the advisory committee and the steering committee of independent scientists for the whole trial. Thank you for your attention.